everybody. It's a great pleasure and, of course, a great honor to present this session, for which Stewart Clegg is the keynote speaker. Stewart was awarded the Edith Penrose Prize, sponsored by INSEAD and EURAM last year. It would take far too long to retrace Stewart's entire career. Not that Stewart is very old, you see he's young as ever, but because his career is far too rich. Let's say that Stewart is known to all researchers working on organizations for his work on power. When you think of power in organizations or in firms, you think of Stewart Clegg, and when you think of Stewart Clegg, you think of power. Actually, this is reductive because Stewart's theoretical contributions are multiple. He also studied legitimacy, hierarchy, and also reflexivity in management studies, serendipity, all, I think, with a dominant idea, which is very important, that of relativity without relativism. And with his colleagues, he has also worked on strategy, and with a book with a magnificent title, a very short, fairly interesting, and reasonably cheap book about studying strategy. Today, Stewart will talk about the Jester, and we are obviously with the Jester confronted with a figure linked to power. The other great power theorist, maybe Stewart Clegg's rival, saw this point, because even when he follows a story written by another, as it is the case with As You Like It and Thomas Lodge, Shakespeare only makes one change. He adds a character of Jester, and this Jester is called Touchstone, and probably this is suggesting the role of the Jester to be the touchstone of social relations, and especially of power relations. And when there is something rotten in the state of Denmark, when we are faced with a disruption of power, it seems to be because the Jester, the poor Yorick, Shakespeare says, a fellow of infinite jest, is dead and has not been replaced. And when you think that William Shakespeare was born in Stratford and Stewart Clegg was born in Bradford, you think there must be something in the English fords that predestines the analysis of power and the analysis of the Jester. Stewart, we are now listening to you with great pleasure and interest.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that charming introduction. All right, I want to begin by making a simple statement, the truth of which I'm sure everyone will recognize. Given the propensity of the politically powerful to practice buffoonery, a talent prominent fools in recent political office of some importance have perfected, contemporary opportunities for satire and irony are indeed plentiful. The names that spring to mind, I'm sure, will be common to you. However, it's less to these jokers that we turn in this paper. Instead, we wish to focus on our own profession, that of the academic. The suggestion is that academics are especially well positioned to play the role of Jester. Not, I hasten to add, in any mode that's disrespectful. On the contrary, we frame the Jester as an expression of courage and citizenship. Academics can assume the position of Jester from different perspectives without losing their credibility. And we define the Jester as a role that reveals organizationally uncomfortable truths through tease, irony, and foolery, articulating what wiser counsel might think is unspeakable, thus challenging taboos without risking expulsion or social isolation. Now, paradoxically, academics accepting the role of Jester can better serve their intellectual license as actors that speak truth to power. Doing so does not simply mean committing to a radical critique. As the court jesters of old, business academics perform a significant role in reproducing dominant beliefs, values, and practices. Even when we commit to challenge management practices that we judge unsustainable or unethical, critique cannot be either the sole objective or a way to appease our guilty conscience. It should rather commit to producing actual change through enhancing reflexivity against the dead weight of traditions of rationality. And it may well be easier to generate reform by pointing up the ridiculousness of what is taken for granted as organizational normalcy, rather than losing one's audience by grandstanding opposition. Management and organization studies has much to reflect and to criticize. Organizations can indeed be very strange places, even tragicomic. Absurdities abound, such as setting sometimes tyrannical targets as substitutes for managing realities. So a case in point was that of the CEO who said that we are here in order to change this world. Nothing less than that interests me. The speaker was Adam Newman, co-founder and former CEO of WeWork. Newman was known for his recreational marijuana use and for encouraging drinking, particularly in raucous tequila sessions at work events. He sometimes showed up barefoot, inviting his team to hold hands and pray in the pursuit of his vision. In reality, what he achieved was the creation of an organization culture that tolerated gender discrimination, recreational drug use inspired by the CEO, nepotism, and sexual harassment. He didn't stay chairman forever. It's hard to imagine any sane response to the practice of such presumption, pretension, and posturing. Hardly world-changing, but certainly criminal endangering. Now, while Newman as a leader should not be taken seriously, he's not unique. Faced with such entitled executive behavior, management scholars may need to jest and to do so seriously. And the art of humor is seriously rational business. Jesting may appear inappropriate if we view our role as producers of more precise, more general, or more accurate theoretical and technical knowledge. Yet, have we scholars of the prosaic not also the responsibility of questioning and critically challenging the status quo, pleasing and displeasing on the basis of honesty? Well, what characteristics define the role of the jester? There are several. Their unifying trait is exposing or rendering salient the persistent contradictions of organization, paradoxically providing a space for without finalizing critique. The outcome of jesting is itself paradoxical, being ridiculous and tragic, wise and a fool, mocking and loyal. The jester both subverts and provides a safety valve, which distinguishes the role from resistance and loyalty, although incorporating elements of both. Hence, performing the role of the jester allows accepting, embracing, and navigating the contradictions that characterize the prosaic life of organizations, untapping tensions that can agitate but can also revitalize our discipline's understanding of that which they write. Now, historically, the jester has been an almost universal presence throughout the ages, wherever the organization of governing was taken seriously. In absolute monarchies, the jester could cause rulers to doubt their actions, make them reconsider, relieving them of their courtly isolation from the plotting of the court. The jester, as a role not constrained within courtly society, can act as a social mechanism that different people may perform in different ways at various moments. We'll start by outlining a history of the jester, exploring its historical and relational presence in theatres of power. I'll highlight the paradoxical traits of the jester, constructing a typology of the jesting role to discuss the implications of the role the jester plays and might play in management learning, both in terms of educational institutions and in corporate environments. The paper can be read as a defense of the role of the jester, with a special focus on the case of academics. And this role is seen not as a primary responsibility, but one that, when it's wisely used, can serve to counter conventions as well as absurdities and rigidities. It builds on Karl Weick's advice to cultivate ambivalence as an invitation to learn, involving a propensity to self-subvert. As Rhodes suggests, there's an important element of ambivalence in jesting that mocks authority in a carnivalesque manner, opening space for critique without presuming to know or to tell what should be done. The wise fool embodies paradox by exposing the contradictions of organizing practices. Yet this exposes itself as paradoxical, despite its disruptive potential. Its questioning preserves order. Jesting in and with contemporary organizations both maintains and questions through practices of subversion. I'll conclude the paper by suggesting that liberating laughter is a wise and undervalued way in which management learning can occur. Hence the usefulness of the Jester as a figure whose verbal and non-verbal messages aim to convey uncomfortable truths that, if communicated other than as jest, would risk termination with extreme prejudice rather than producing reconsideration and change. So historically, the court jester offered an elevated role in which to play the fool with distinct social purposes. Central to both Western and non-Western cultures, the jester is both an historical institution and a cultural trope. The role of the jester is critically necessary to counter the rigidities of established power circuits, to uncover absurdities and secret truths, which often everyone knew, everyone knows that everyone knew, while everyone behaves as if they didn't know. Jesters often confront people with absurd situations and pragmatic paradoxes that are difficult to unfreeze and to change, even on the part of the top executives, especially when they're engaged in circular dynamics. In this sense, the modern jester's role can be played not only by a specific person, be it as an organizational member or an outsider, but also by top leaders and even by the CEO. I see the jester as an archetypal character, personifying paradox and pointing out life's paradoxes for others. The jester provides a productive metaphor, useful in identifying different forms of paradox and considering how they may be treated and with what effect. Teaching and learning through provocation, exaggeration, irritation, and humor can be instrumental in revealing and coping with the paradoxes of organizing. It's a well-established tradition that some people in organizations may use jokes to alleviate the tension arising from having to deal with paradoxical requirements. Mockery and parody are typical of situations in which humor is used to reveal cracks and faults in apparently impregnable structures and logics of hegemonic power. Now, an example of this is the Anarchic slogan adopted by the Italian student movement in the 1970s, which explicitly employed ridicule and irony to subvert dominant discourses, a laughter that will bury you all. In organizational contexts, the use of parody denaturalizes culturally embedded practices and conceptions of organizational identity. Thus, through humor, a seed of doubt may be sown in an audience. Certainly that seed of doubt must have been sown in Italy, given the subsequent election of a comedian as a leader of a powerful political party. Well, paradox involves being wise and being a fool. In royal courts, jesters were allowed to tell the truth to the sovereign in an oblique way by acting as sage fools, whose function was to disturb with glimpses of confounding truths that elude rational definition. Burving states that jesters could hold up a mirror to society, showing its unpleasant sides, without the risk of losing their possession, as anyone else doing likewise certainly would. Jesters can speak the unspeakable. They can say that the emperor has no clothes on and that the empress is obese. And Shakespeare was mentioned in the introduction, and here he is. The famous Shakespearean line from Twelfth Night, that one's wise enough to play the fool, well encapsulates the first paradox that the historical figure of the court jester embodied. Acting a role as intelligent insane, the jester was able to employ subtle and sophisticated forms of critique. The independent contrast between wisdom and foolishness has a long philosophical lineage connected with the etymological root of the term paradox as going against para, commonly held knowledge, doxa, highlighting the importance of challenging conventional wisdom. The jester's role is sometimes akin to that of the Socratic gadfly, a humble creature whose role is to irritate the state, as Plato said, a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size. Paradox involves paradoxing, and telling the truth. A second paradoxical tension that characterized the jester resides between satire and truthfulness. Humor can undermine and disrupt an existing order through revealing its paradoxes, its inconsistencies and irrationalities. Being an entertainer, a prankster, and a satirist provides the jester with a license to speak certain truths to power, framing as a joke what would otherwise be construed as disrespectful, subversive, or even stupid. For jesters, exaggeration and mockery are essential resources in preserving independent thought. A historical example of how mockery could be used to express inconvenient truths is the story of the French jester who had to report a crushing defeat suffered by the royal fleet to King Philip IV. He first attracted the king's attention by screaming, "The English cowards!" And when asked by his sovereign to explain, he said, "Because they don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French." In this example, the jester personifies the archetypal character capable of critiquing power, in this case of the king, and the ideology, in this case of nationalism, through zest. Paradox is teasing as an outsider and not offending as an insider. So a third paradoxical tension that characterizes historical jesters is the symbiotic relationship with their rulers. This is a joking relationship, what the anthropologist Radcliffe Brown defined as a relation between two persons, in which one is by custom permitted and in some instances required to tease or to make fun of the other, who in turn is required to take no offense. On the one hand, jesters were the only ones allowed to abandon established norms, to violate expectations, to exaggerate and distort, to challenge social hierarchies, at least within limits. The role was well captured by George Bernard Shaw's quip that every despot must have one disloyal subject to keep him sane. On the other hand, jesters were fiercely loyal to the eminent objects of their foolish ridicule, perhaps due to a shared sense of isolation. The jester's power to act was only through the monarch. Historically, in courtly societies, jesters were expected to act as much more than mere entertainers, performing various household responsibilities, including that of being the monarch's messenger on the battlefield. In the case of the Ottoman courts, the duties of court jesters could even include carrying out extrajudicial killings on behalf of the Sultan. Thus, the freedom to joke and tease was strictly bounded. The jester could offer critique, but exclusively within the boundaries of the court and its rules. So paradox of abnormality and capacity, of forgery and authenticity. A final paradox concerns the bodily appearance of jesters. While some were able-bodied professional performers, many were characterized by various highly visible conditions such as dwarfism or kyphosis, being hunchbacked or facially scarred by pockmarks. Some were even considered feeble-minded or retarded, a feature that could work as a protective shield against potential side effects. When the jester's revelations regarding court society became too painful, clearly offending those in power, his remarks could be sidelined with reference to a limited mental capacity. In addition to its superstitious protective value, physical deformity constituted a reminder of the ruler's own shortcomings. It also might have functioned as a memento mori, remember you shall die, for the ruler. Indeed, again, Shakespeare, as we heard in the introduction, the skull of a jester, Yorick, is employed by Shakespeare as the ultimate reminder of mortality. Tension is also expressed in the relationship between authenticity and forgery. The comedic mask of the performer hides the inner tragedy of its wearer. Perhaps, however, it's the opposite, as the apparent tragedy of the crooked bodies of the court fool turn into a precious and cherished resource. Well, these historical reflections on the contradictions embedded by court jesters, wise fools, parodists telling the truth, insiders, outsiders, fake, authentic, they are still valid for contemporary practices of jesting. Jesters have retained their usefulness in contemporary society, even if they don't wear a cap and bells and hat anymore. So I want now to consider the potential of jesting in the context of today's organizations. So the jester speaks truth to power. Now, contemporary applications of the role of corporate jester maintain similarities with the traditional role, but are not correspondent. We can explore possible expressions of jesting in organizational practice and scholarship, importing ideas from adjacent fields such as social movements and political science. We can suggest that even though explicit references to jesters have been rare in the literature, several practices that can be assimilated to jesting have been considered in organizational studies. We can use the notion of the jester as an umbrella concept, articulating several roles related to the functions associated with jesting. And we define organizational jesting as the use of humor, satire, and absurdity to perform a systematic challenge of organizational doxa, the taken for granted unquestioned truths underpinning the functioning of an organization. Thus, jesting is inherently reflexive. If one is in on the joke, it can deepen enjoyment at work by pointing up irksome constraints on being at work. Today's organizations, despite various external perspectives ranging from independent governance boards to outside auditors and consultants, seem to be in need of such courageous and caring inventions. So courageous and reflexivity enhancing interventions can be cultivated in various ways, such as fostering psychological safety by encouraging individuals to speak up. However, psychological safety may not be enough. Even in organizations that claim to be embracing psychological safety, members may feel vulnerable and may well have substantive reasons to consider themselves at risk. Even within a psychologically safe climate, employees may believe that being loyal to the organization or their bosses requires hiding some uncomfortable truths. Speaking up has its limits: the wish to keep interpersonal harmony intact, the lack of power to expose impossible requests, or simply the need to flatter the power holder. All of these may constrain individuals from speaking up. In this context, one variant of the Jester may promote reflexive interventions, even if in oblique ways. And this is a role that academics are well positioned to conduct. Doing this can constitute a viable response to pragmatic paradoxes that confront people with impossible choices. Moreover, academic jesting may be critical in supporting inquiry, questioning crystallized power structures that resist change. It's possible to identify several different ways that academics can play the important functions traditionally assigned to the Jester. Some critics criticize directly, others do so indirectly through alternative and oppositional ideas. To distinguish them based on the previous discussion, I compose a categorical typology, a typology derived from crossing two dimensions of the Jester's role. The first dimension is derived from Gouldner's distinction between cosmopolitans and locals. Jesters can be locals who are insiders to a community of practice with which they jest as organization members, or they can be outsiders, members of quite separate and more cosmopolitan communities of practice, looking in and speaking up about some other community. And the second dimension is reflexivity. Jesters cannot perform their jesting role without some degree of reflexivity. I might pop the next slide up, there we go. The second dimension is reflexivity. Jesters cannot perform their jesting role without some degree of reflexivity, although there are differences in the way that reflexivity manifests itself. I can distinguish between strong reflexivity, aimed at revealing and challenging the assumptions on which any organization system is based through translating its terms by those of another, and weak reflexivity, which hints at these assumptions through irony, suggesting their existence without challenging them openly. In the classic sociological manner, crossing the two dimensions results in four different ideal typical roles identified in the figure that jesting could perform for contemporary organizations. Roles that will never be quite as bounded as a typology might suggest, that do indeed leak and seed into each other. Ideal types are like that. Gadflies position themselves as outsiders that rely on knowledge premised on deep organization experience, who are directly probing the organizational doxa. Ludic intertextualists also cause offense to convention, but they operate within the organizational context, entangling the texts of practice and theory. Consigliere are weakly reflexive in more local and cosmopolitan ways. They adjust their advice to the unfolding of events and strive to induce incremental changes in the status quo. And translators are those for whom the jest resides precisely in translation, recasting the meaning that prior sense-making has made, ironicizing the doxa, satirizing through critical performativity that juxtaposes different ways of representing realities. So the Jester types play different roles with paradoxical attributes. They all aim to speak truth to power, knowing to do so is risky, given the fact that power is not always inclined to hearing the truth. So let's look at the Gadfly. The Gadfly brings change through irritation. The ideal typical Gadfly combines the convictions of knowledge with the critical ethos that, if only it were followed, would help renewal and growth. Utilizing a subversive language, the Gadfly challenges taken for granted assumptions, managerial hubris, and the rigidity induced by past successions. The Gadfly effect on organization outcomes arises from being irritants or parasites. And this role is expressed by critical authors who maintain a distance from the system, the better to perceive its flaws. And when such a scholar adopts the Jester's role, they can use exaggeration to amplify the message's impact. They also stress their distance, their separateness from the system they criticize, mock, and hassle. The Gadfly's advantage is that his perspective gives permission to amplify parts of the message that might be better conveyed with a measure of voluntary distortion. Martin Parker, whose illustration is on the side of a cover of one of his books, is a masterful practitioner of the art, expressing his claims against management, his calls to shut down the business school, his critique of the Mac University, or his analogy and association between Tony Soprano and organizational excellence. One can claim that the business school should be dead, as Parker does, in order to better expose its flaws. Now, when we think about the applications of the Gadfly, the academic critic that mocks the system offers an interesting example of a necessary and thought-provoking, but also problematic stance. The necessity of an external irritant for stimulating change derives from the impossibility of establishing an effective communication between distinct communication systems. Academics or consultants belonging to an auto-referential system, which is separate by the other closed systems they study, do not produce change in organizations by rationally persuading decision makers, but by provoking irritations which trigger internal communications they cannot control. Observing a system at a distance through a comedic lens affords an ambiguous space in which laughter at something is indirectly laughing about us. TV shows such as The Office or The Simpsons see the serious business of the everyday organizational world from a comical distance. Such programs can be a source of inspiration for office gadflies that use humor to resist organizational normative control attempts, such as Westwood and Johnson found in the implementation of a workplace justice program. Excerpts from The Office were used in the justice program to try and train normatively appropriate behavior. Employees read the excerpts as a parody of the performativity of management, gender, and political correctness, a parody that they were then able to adopt in the work life. Ostensibly, normative regulation was served, but the joke was in the detail. Through humor, they were both maintaining an illusion of being regulated at the same time as their performance goaded the power and authority of their superiors through its evident inauthenticity. They were being gadflies. So despite these difficulties, academic practice that invites one to look at organizations with a satirical lens allows the potential to expose and ridicule some organizational practices. The Gadfly is especially qualified to study the fads, fashions, and fetishism of organization theories and practice, because these become more visible from outside the ranks of true believers and adherents. The Gadfly always organizes from a cynical distance. However, this distance is difficult to maintain, especially as academic gadflies draw status and rewards from their role in reproducing the same practice at which they carp. As careers progress, what was once a source of satire can become a daily routine. Jesters, much as poachers, can become gamekeepers, administering those rules whose existence they once mocked. The most intelligent gadflies acknowledge this contradiction, using humor to cope with the paradox, as does Parker in his reflections on his own role as a business school art manager in an article titled Becoming Manager, or The Werewolf Looks Anxiously in the Mirror, Checking for Unusual Facial Hair. An additional paradox is that a critical management gadfly can be seen as parasitical to management. It's dependent on the very thing it critiques to provide them with an identity. Academic tribes often lack the capacity to encourage their members to laugh at themselves. Organization theory, with its paradigm warriors and citation cartels, is riddled with theoretical fetishes that persist long past their utility. Intellectual Ponzi schemes in which the early investors reap the returns and those that labor in their wake enrich the intellectual capital of the early investors. In these circumstances, stimulating irony can be an antidote against the sort of obeisance, docility, and reserve in service to ideas and positions tightly held that may cause more harm than good. Now, ludic intertextualists. To be ludic is to be playful, engaging in free activity that deals with but is not an accustomed part of the seriousness of everyday livelihood. Ludic jesting is that combination of playfulness and work that sees itself at some distance from the normatively ordered seriousness of the everyday work world, while acknowledged being an insider embroiled in the communication and ordering system that's the target of jest. In terms of that world, it can be seen as inconsequential, not just playful, but perhaps foolish. Indeed, in business schools, to play the fool is liminal business, as Jim March once explained to me in terms of his relation to the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. March advocated for playfulness, understood as deliberate temporary relaxations of rules, as one of the components of a decisional technology based on foolishness, a technology of foolishness. As Larson notes in a later article, March wrote explicitly about the heroism of fools, manifesting in blindly believing in an idea and being deaf to feedback from so-called reality. Indeed, he made a movie about Don Quixote to explore these themes. Indeed, as Larson's article makes clear, in terms of reception, March's ideas about foolishness have been treated as foolish by authors such as Chris Argyris and Ruggiero. Mostly the technology of foolishness is not regarded by organization and management scholars seriously. There are exceptions. For instance, Isaac sees foolishness as an integral part of wisdom, while Alverson and Spicer explicitly see the majority of the normatively ordered seriousness of the everyday world as functionally stupid, as lacking reflexivity, lacking substantive rather than formal rationality, and foolishness can punctuate critique and enliven these circumstances. We can take the lack of reflexivity of those organizations that comprise much of the everyday working world as a key phenomenon. And it's that lack of reflexivity that makes them dull places, easily able to be analyzed from a jesting perspective. The ludic academic intertextuality engages with these texts of everyday stupidity and limited reflexivity. The stupid organization can be sparked into new understanding by a little playfulness, and this was integral to Jim March's perspective. Playfulness can create moments of reflexivity, intelligent holes in a dark space of routines, in which the sheer unreflected drudgery of much of which passes for normal can be glimpsed. New openings, twists and folds in the structures and routines of mundanity can be grasped if glimpsed and reflected on. The point then of a technology of foolishness is not to destroy order, but to renew it, to make it new again. Ideas that Yanis Gabriel explores with the concept of unmanaged spaces in organizations. Now, Jim March, who you can see on the left of your screen, the gentleman with the glasses, although a successful ludic jester in his writing, is not the only one. Although academic jesters are not necessarily taken seriously, they're often considered to be too theoretical and too far away from real life to be taken seriously. At a time when institutional theory had yet to be routinized in its current invention, for instance, the most creative theorist of institutions was already using the occasional ludic jest to make reflexive and telling points about organizations. Irving Goffman, our second character, looking straight to screen, in his book Asylums, which developed the notion of total institution, did so by humbling the mighty and elevating the outcasts. Elite boarding schools and psychiatric institutions were placed on an equivalent footing. Moral learning inscribed in the curriculum and the playing fields of the former also occurred, he insisted, on the part of the inmates of the institution, people whom Goffman regarded as equally having moral careers. And we can go back to other liminal figures in our field, such as Thorstein Veblen, the gentleman on the right of the screen. As Watson acknowledges, citing Conroy, when the theory of the leisure class was first published, it was frequently misread as a literary satire of the nouveau riche of the period, which missed entirely the seriousness of his social and economic criticism. Genre expectations on the part of readers, not to mention the gatekeepers of publication, acts powerfully as an ideological effect and form of policing in the social sciences. And further back in time, there are many passages of humor in Marx's Capital. Marx, as an intellectual insider, deeply familiar with his political economy predecessors, such as John Stuart Mill, could be acerbically witty about their contributions. It's an interpretation that accedes with Edmund Wilson's view that Marx was certainly the greatest ironist in Swift. More generally, Ween's reading of Capital through Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, suggests a more cosmopolitan sense of jest. For Francis Ween, and I quote, "Like Tristram Shandy, Das Kapital is full of paradoxes and hypotheses, abstruse explanations and whimsical tomfoolery, fractured narratives and curious oddities. How else could he do justice to the mysterious and often topsy-turvy logic of capitalism? The book can be read as a black farce in debunking the phantom-like objectivity of the commodity to expose the differences between heroic appearance and inglorious reality. Marx is using one of the classic methods of comedy, stripping off the gallant knight's armor to reveal a tubby little man in his underpants. Or perhaps it's a satirical utopia, like the land of the Houyhnhnms in Gulliver's Travels, where every prospect pleases and only man is vile. In Marx's version of a capitalist society, as in Jonathan Swift's equine pseudo-paradise, the false Eden is created by reducing ordinary humans to the status of impotent, alienated yahoos. And this is an interpretation that cedes with Edmund Wilson's view that Marx was certainly the greatest ironist in Swift. With the interpretation that Marx was a humorist and a Gothic writer, this might seem shocking to the overly serious-minded used to reading Capital. I concur that the text is both deadly serious and deeply ironical. It ironically recasts the heroic figures of early capitalist businessmen into capital opposing labor, into bourgeois and proletariat, into a system that recast its characters and their relations in a wholly new narrative of exploitation of surplus value. And Marx's work still inspires many contemporary organizations, including a past president of the Academy of Management, Paul Adler. So what are the applications of ludic intertextuality? Well, where to begin? The BBC, perhaps. The British Broadcasting Corporation, long a stalwart organization for the promotion of comedy, took the unusual step in 2015 of launching a program called W1A, an ironic comedy drama that was reflexive both about itself and organizational change. And Seabear has used the series to apply the theoretical lens of intertextuality to analyze this application of ludic criticism to an organization undergoing change management. In doing so, she notes a double hermeneutic in play. First, a prolonged satire and ironical discourse on the BBC, and second, mockery of the management fads and fashions being used as tools of organizational development and change by the managers represented in the BBC. So focusing on this intertextuality is to follow a well-traveled route. She cites media including The Simpsons, The Bill, The Office, Wall Street, The Firm, Rawhide, Mad Men, The Wire, etc. Ludic criticism that relies on intertextuality requires an audience sophisticated enough to get the joke at the expense of something for which there is a strong sense of commitment, a cause deemed noble and worthwhile, as well as an audience for its performance. It requires a cosmopolitan sensibility, one capable of reading the performance on several levels simultaneously. While this may be presumed in the audience for the BBC, it seems to be in less supply elsewhere, for instance, in business. In a capitalist world of business schools that harbor certain sorts of intertextuality that are evidently pro-business will find much more appreciative and ready audiences than those oriented antithetically. Note the fate of critical scholars at Leicester University in the UK, many of whom have expressed themselves through their wit, such as Gibson Burrell. And elsewhere, we can note the recent attacks on critical scholarship in France. In the serious business of business schooling, criticism of any kind, let alone playfulness deploying ludic critique, is too often not treated intertextually, but all too literally as not normal. So the Consigliere, some serious jesting. Jesting has not exclusively been expressed through humor and mockery. At times, court jesters engaged in very serious activities. The bourgeois mental sclerosis caused by isomorphic tendencies in search of legitimacy can be resisted not only with buffoonery, but also by means of authentic, serious work performed by insiders, agents following an explicit mandate of the dominant coalition. since consultants, academics, and practitioners operate within distinct self-referential communication systems, as we know from Newman. Their attempts at communicating among themselves are little more than charades. Consigliere explicitly apply techniques and professional expertise with the intent of helping organizations to overcome their self-induced limitations. The purposeful and technically rational nature of their endeavor does not imply that the changes they sometimes induce derive from the application of a blueprint informed by evidence and codified knowledge. There is likely to be the result of a fashionable approach promoted as part of current knowledge management, cynically mocked in private while promoted in public. The role of consigliere can be performed by serious technical advisors, such as consultants, or even by spin doctors, helping top managers to create narratives that put the organization in a good light with relevant stakeholders. Such actions have a capacity to question the system by causing doubt on the accepted logic, issuing uncomfortable reflections that become paradoxically acceptable because they can always be taken in jest. I've actually used the example of Alexander Campbell. I could have perhaps more recently have used the example of Dominic Cummings here, for those who are au fait with British forms of, well, British, I won't say anymore, familiar with British politics. British buffoonery is what I was going to say. So thinking about applications, given the tensions associated with change and stability, using humor has been presented as an important characteristic of external critics and advisors. Humor can help others cope with the sometimes difficult advice an honest consigliere dispenses to deal with stressful procedures and processes. Learning how to use humor to stimulate learning can thus be a form of identifying problems and facilitating change. As Dumez stated, one among many other roles a consultant has to assume can involve playing the fool. And this does not mean that in the normal course of events, I'm quoting, the consultant is asked specifically to take on the role. Often both parties aren't even aware that he or she is doing so, nor how important the role is in keeping the organization firmly tied to reality. Occasionally, however, senior executives realize how essential a corporate jester can be. I'll just pause for some water. So the academic consigliere can induce doubt. Academics, being in a liminal position, can use their state to ask questions others cannot. Doing so implies a condition of independence that's not guaranteed. Academics may be hired for specific events, training, for shows, to emphasize organizational dimensions that need change. And these events often respond well to presentation of issues difficult for the audience in a light mode. Organizational recourse to academia may serve to illuminate the functioning of power circuits, normally hidden and conveyed in interpersonal relations that become normal and uncontested. Academic independence permits all sorts of questioning, including that which could be perceived as revealing ignorance or even invite ridicule. Yet if the consigliere academic risks becoming captured by the executive imagination and maintaining the status quo, it might imply losing the capacity for jesting. So translator, the jest is in translation. Finally, authentic attempts at challenging an organization's doxa can come from actors that perform the role of translation. The classic example of the jest being in the translation is that of C. Wright Mills on the motorbike, translating Talcott Parsons on the right, his abstruse theoretical system. Few can have read Mills' translation of Parsons without raising a smile. Indeed, critically inclined management and organization scholars frequently play this role. Asked to present to an MBA class or a meeting of local business people on a current topic such as stretched goals, humor becomes a handy way of both explaining and cautioning against being too convinced. When business school academics take part in a panel of industry experts, provoking innovative thought by challenging some of the taken for granted assumptions and principles, framing discussion, using humor to translate insights from their field into that of the unfamiliar, into that of those unfamiliar with it, disarms. Attempts to bring about reform and emancipation in organizational practice under the banner of critical performativity, organized efforts to make critical research more relevant outside academia, producing social change, would also fit this bill. The approach explicitly aims at promoting new forms of organizing that are more socially and environmentally sustainable. Students and executives, often one and the same, can use such an approach to explore power, not as something strictly individual, but relational. And the absence of this role can also be used to invite them to think about the isolation of leaders. In some instances, academics may adopt a role of jester, engaged in translation to encourage questioning of taken for granted philosophical, ethical, or human truths of everyday life, or of those novelties that are often imported by management, fashion, and fads. Of course, a teacher may also invite students to assume such a role. Encouraging them to understand the organizational role of the jester in history may be beneficial in this regard. And proponents of critical performativity might frown at the wise folly of trying to bring about emancipatory change only through a communicative performance. But by using humor, they can inspire, stir, galvanize audiences, planting the seeds of change as they translate taken for granted practices into a joke against a different form of knowledge, grown and seeded in a distinct but alien community of practice, one embedded in a specifically academic form of life. So applications, well, there's a tradition of academic humor and satire used to translate science into everyday understanding as a means of action best captured by media programs such as the BBC science show called The Infinite Monkey Cage. Humor is a tool that may provide a measure of protection against political risk. In some cases, translators can go beyond the use of humor and put themselves in the role of the jester, criticizing, not by confronting in a straightforward, direct way, but by making fun of assumptions that are scientifically questionable. Students and executives participating in training programs may develop awareness about the relevance and added value of jesting that warns against absurdities and blind spots. Such jesting may operate as a critical mirror, allowing identification of imperfections as perceived by diverse stakeholders. Note, however, that this form of jesting may neutralize its effectiveness when mobilized by agendas that polarize and disengage those whom they should be able to convince. At this point, that which is being translated runs the risk of being seen more as ideological dogma than scientific work. And where this is the case, performativity becomes a source of conflict rather than an occasion for reflexive change. And such activism may even make organizations and authorities bunker themselves within rationalist economic arguments that hinder change. So the four characters are distinct in many ways. All types of the academic jesting, however, share a common paradoxical trait, the challenging of the organizational doxa, the consistent set of tacit assumptions, taken for granted practices, and self-reinforcing power structures that both enable and constrain organized action in a specific context. Each of these four positions is imbued with a specific pivotal tension and emphasizes one of the four paradoxes inherent to jesting mentioned above. Gadfly's exaggerated distort, a requirement for parody and satire, securing their dogmatism in order to reveal deeper truths. As Seymour notes, for those inclined to trolling, dogma can be easily mistaken for enlightenment. For the ludic intertextualist, it's essential to navigate the wise fool contradiction, putting jesting at the service of what can be formed as if it were rational rather than being ideological. Performance whose effects depend upon the receptivity of the audience. Consigliere may cope with the need to embrace organizational goals and respecting local expertise while adding value by offering different perspectives and sources of knowledge with which they can challenge entrenched ways of doing things. The academic translator deals with the contrast between life worlds, the immediacy of commercial considerations and the future of the planet, for instance, operate on vastly different scales. Sometimes overlapping academic and intervention orientations can create reputational issues on both academic and practice fronts. Academics as jesters can provide contemporary management and organization studies with a stimuli for change and learning as challenges of the status quo. All these actors will face the paradoxical difficulties corresponding to the role, given the nature of the function, while organizations may benefit from their presence. They can do so because of the purpose of jesting as both unsettling and supportive of organizational functioning. Jesting aims at critically probing a set of accepted truths that, if left unquestioned, would lead to competency traps and to dysfunctional stupidity. In doing so, academic jesting doesn't necessarily undermine the status quo, but it can point up to some of its pathologies. In management and organization studies, the complexity of the figure of the jester is being used as a demeaning term of reference. Donaldson used it to attack what he saw as the coming doxa of anti-management postmodern theories, accusing them of not taking organizations seriously. There is at times almost a quality of the jester or prankster about the view that organizations are the opposite of what they seem, and that rationality in organizations is mythic. In riposte, as a jest, Donaldson was reviewed as satire by myself. Now, Lounsbury and Carberry used the notion of court jester to denounce organization theory's belittlement of the influence of Max Weber, noting that the tendencies to domination in organizations that characterized his time have not disappeared in ours. The framing of domination as the probability that a command will be obeyed may have shape-shifted, but it is still what it was, an imposition. Despite this, much contemporary mainstream management and organization theory does not attend to contemporary forms of domination, framing the working lives of the multitude that render service to organizations. At best, the idea of jester has been introduced to express the opportunity to ally criticism with impunity or to act as change agents without responsibility for what ensues. Contemporary organizations may benefit from the services of academics as jesters. Contemporary organizations, in spite of external perspectives brought by those external boards, need independent, courageous, and caring inventions. As an outsider on the inside, academic jesters can alert and challenge the status quo, creating doubt over most heartfelt beliefs through irony and other forms of critical imagination, fostering a greater awareness of problematic situations that destabilize and denaturalize hegemonic discourses, in other words, conveying truth to power. Historically, the organizations in which jesters were nurtured, those of courtly society, were often plagued by flattery, obsequiousness, and sycophancy. Organizational jesters were not always effective in fighting such symptoms, either in the past or more recently. An illustrated case of the latter is Paul Birch, one of the best known contemporary formally appointed corporate jesters, who was officially assigned the role between 1994 and 1995 of corporate jester for British Airways. Despite the positive publicity he brought to the airline, he was sacked by the new CEO, showing that in contemporary organizations and medieval courts alike, jesters are always dependent on the tolerance of their masters. Such dependency represents a paradoxical challenge for organizations. The masters most likely to benefit from the jester role are those least likely to welcome the jester's message, Trump being the epitome. For the most problematic and toxic cases such as this, it's almost impossible to jest beyond the joke that is arraigned in front of reason. Academics in these contexts may benefit from independence from the necessity of being respectful to the managerial hierarchy. In the case of academics, exaggeration can become a caricature of reality rather than a call for reflection. Its expression therefore involves a delicate combination for the academic jester, if only because desacralizing leaders and managers has its own dangers as well. In summary, the academic jester needs to be able to speak the truth while maintaining the necessary academic gravitas expected from the role. They therefore follow a narrow path between extremes. Jesting has practical and ethical limits, and it may simply be inappropriate in face of the challenges to desacralize leadership without destroying its sacred nature. The centrality of notions of rationality and technique in contemporary management and organization studies would seem to leave little space for the liberties of jester. But nonetheless, as Bakhtin puts it in the quote in front of you, laughter purifies from dogmatism, from the intolerant and the petrified. It liberates from fanaticism and pedantry, from fear and intimidation, from didactism, naivety and illusion, from single meaning, the single level, from sentimentality. Laughter does not permit seriousness to atrophy and to be torn away from the one being forever incomplete. It restores this ambivalent wholeness. So management learning then can incorporate jesting in both the practice of organizations and the management curricula. Academic jesting can be framed as an expression of the logic of care in organizational contexts saturated by power relations. Used constructively to surface and reframe contradictions and paradoxes that characterize management and organization theory, the Jester has value as a source of creativity and learning, especially when met with the capacity to accept and be invigorated by tensions. Strategies to navigate such tensions can include momentary separation of opposite poles, the use of practices to work through paradox, the development of interpretive rhetoric that reframes contradictions. And closer to professional concerns, when constrained by limits on agency in responding to organizational contradictions, debilitating pragmatic paradoxes can ensue. When management academics are forced by imperative directives to demonstrate that each of their research outputs simultaneously adds to groundbreaking theory and has accessible impact on practices, paralysis and frustration will likely ensue amongst the black humor that follows. I think any Australian or British colleagues who've been used to research assessment exercises will get the point of those words. Jesting as a set of practices leveraging humor, satire, and absurdity to question the taken for granted truths that enable but also constrain organizational action is a paradoxical strategy. It is so literally in that its purpose is to challenge the doxa, but it is so substantially because its purpose is to challenge equilibrium. Jesting acts as a form of meta-communication and message aimed at providing instruction on how to interpret other messages. As such, it allows making contradictions and issues salient so they can be treated without causing a breakdown in the system. While it seems challenging to fragile structures of power, as was the case for the Soviet regime, it can strengthen already robust forms of domination. The implications for management learning should be clear. Do not fear critique and satire. Do not lionize obscurity and seriousness. Use humor and laughter to broaden and build. Innovative ways to deconstruct organizational taboos and convey truth to power can bring humor, laughter, and jesting not just to the boardroom, but also to the classroom, where current and future boardrooms are educated and trained. A lesson that jests against its audience, especially those most powerful in it, is a lesson much more likely to be remembered and acted on one that dulls imagination through ritual incantations of scholarly legitimization. To be sure, the latter may be needed to make it to print, but to make ideas public in performance, a facility of an apt jest and a ready, if sometimes scabrous wit may stand the learning in good stead. Management and organization studies perhaps needs to be less serious, to imbue more seriousness in discussions about rigidities, dogma, and absurdities in organizational life. At the same time, it's important to be aware of the limits of jesting as a form of critique and challenge to the status quo. While jesting can help questioning and preserving the sanity of an organizational system, correcting inequalities and distortions cannot be taken for granted. So, the liberation afforded by laughter, in conclusion, speaks to the joy of losing ourselves in a collective play with ideas, a serious play of bantering associations, ridicule of established ways, and combination of things few people may ordinarily think belong together, as my friend Arne Carlson put it. In keeping with this spirit, in this article, I've defended the importance of Jester's roles as expressing a paradoxical combination of cleverness and foolishness, in which foolishness is a way of not deferring to a set of norms, but of questioning them. Specific ways of filling the role of being an academic jester have been identified. And in conclusion, with the literary philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, I see laughter and ridicule function as a challenge to the sometimes stupid seriousness attributed to authority and power. Through liberating laughter, people are able to take the high and mighty down from their pinnacle and into the gutter to create meaning anew. And people in these instances could include all those denizens of management and organization studies who strive to add to management learning. And that's my talk. And I've ended with a couple of paradoxes from Escher.
Thank you very much, Stewart, for this very stimulating talk and this invitation to escape the spirit of gravity with Nietzsche's words. So we will now take questions. We have, first of all, two questions by Xavier. Is satire appropriate for academic conversation, or could it be considered inappropriate, even insulting? First question. Second question, can we challenge rulers everywhere, including in academia, and existing academic knowledge in a humoristic way? Is that proper for an academic or a scholar?
I think satire is appropriate for academic conversation. It may often be considered inappropriateness, and considering ideas that are not welcomed in citadels of power is often to consider them inappropriate. If it's done deftly and if it's done with the spirit of the jester, I hope not insulting. On occasion, it may well be. Can we challenge rulers everywhere, including in academia and existing academic knowledge, in a humoristic way? Is that proper for an academic or a scholar? Oh, I think it's extremely proper for an academic or a scholar. You know, as I've indicated in the paper, I think some great scholars have done precisely this. C. Wright Mills, Jim March, Karl Marx, Thorstein Veblen, all of these people knew what it was to be very serious intellectuals and to build very serious contributions to the body of knowledge. But they also knew the value of satire and humor, often aimed against existing academic knowledge. So I think that's entirely proper for an academic or a scholar. You know, too much seriousness can make Jack and Jill a dull couple of intellectuals, I think.
Okay, thanks. Maybe you can remove your presentation. Another question. Would you accept that there is no need for a jester when organizations meet the test of containing what Ostrom describes as polycentric governance that avoids excess power to allow tragedies of mismanagement, malpractice, and malfeasance to be avoided? If so, should not scholars avoid the need for jesters by educating managers how to introduce bottom-up stakeholder governance that promotes general well-being with greater efficiency and resilience than organizations that possess excessive power? Otherwise, scholars are not efficiently educating managers how to manage excessive power.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Often the need for jesting arises precisely in the absence of what Elinor Ostrom describes as polycentric governance. And sometimes it arises in such a way that it becomes a parody of itself. The buffoonery of a Boris Johnson or a Donald Trump is I think, a very good example of that. And I think it presents examples of excessive power that does allow tragedies of mismanagement, malpractice, and malfeasance. So yes, I would agree with that. I think that that broad-based poly-governance, inclusive participatory management. But as part of that inclusive participatory management, it is perhaps sometimes useful for the jest to be given and to be taken not in offense, in order to underlie that perhaps some of the polycentricity is proceeding in directions or with effects that may not, on reflection, although they might appear to be quite doxic, they may not be so wise. If I may use another political example, the Prime Minister of Australia has recently been a visitor to the G7 in Cornwall, where he has been clearly very marginalized because of his reluctance to commit to any policies which outline a route to carbon capture and deflection of climate change. In such circumstances, then there's an absence, his reasons for doing this are very clear. There's an absence of the polycentricity that might allow him to be able to make that movement within the political party and coalition that he represents. And perhaps if there were one or two braver individuals in that party and that coalition, the world would indeed be, or our little bit of the world would indeed be set on a better track. So I hope that answers the first part of the question. So if not, should not scholars avoid the need for jesters by educating managers how to introduce bottom-up stakeholder governance that promotes general well-being with greater efficiency and resilience than organizations that possess excessive power? Yes, definitely, but not just bottom-up. Bottom-up suggests inclusion. It suggests those who are included. I think it's very important that polyvalence, that polycentricity should also include those that are stakeholders who are excluded, who are not inside the tent, as it were. And particularly when we look at very serious issues like the effects of organization practices on in terms of anthropocentric dysfunction, then I think it becomes very important to make that stakeholding as broad as possible.
So you can ask questions in the chat. So I have a question. Don't you think that there are, how do you interpret the fact that there seems to be periods during which jesters play a big role? It was the case at Shakespeare's time, Middle Age and Renaissance, and then it disappeared. And it seems to be the same with the academic tradition, because we have had, you mentioned them, you could have mentioned also John Kenneth Galbraith, who was jesting economists of his time and CEOs of his time, but it seems to have a bit disappeared, this tradition. Don't you think there are periods favorable to jesting and other periods less favorable, and how do you interpret that, if this is the case?
Okay, well, in the case of Shakespeare, the demise of the jester was really to do with the demise of courtly society. It was to do with the Cromwellian Revolution and the establishment of a grim and rather punitive Protestantism upon the land. And being a jester was not a healthy place to be. Similarly, in some organizations which are very, very committed to strongly dogmatic views of their mission and mandate, being a jester is not a healthy place to be. My colleague from Ireland, Kate Kenny, recently wrote a really excellent book, a wonderful book on whistleblowing, in which she looked at the fate of a number of whistleblowers in the financial services industry, in which they were clearly illuminating the sorts of issues that led to the global financial crisis. But the kind of criticisms that were being made, and they were being made in seriousness, actually not in jest, but the kind of criticisms that were being made were almost universally not welcomed and were ostracized and excluded by the organizations in question. So when you have a strongly dominant orthodoxy that amounts almost to an ideology in place, and in financial capital in that period that led up to the global financial crisis, I think it would be fair to characterize the leading financial institutions in that way. Then being a jester is a dangerous and probably fruitless pastime, albeit that it's even more necessary in those circumstances than perhaps in others.
Okay, thank you. We have two other questions. In today's societal context, who is the audience of the jester's jokes? For example, social media, such as Twitter feeds, often provide such fora. but to what effect?
I can't see where that question is about Twitter feeds. Can you just repeat the question, please? Oh, I see it. It's at the bottom there. In today's societal context, the audience of the Jester's jokes. For example, social media such as Twitter feeds often provide such fora, but to what effect? Well, I have to confess that I'm a Luddite when it comes to social media. I have nothing to do with it because I find it a waste of my time and frivolous. So I'm no expert on Twitter. I've no examples of Twitter feeds. I'm rather old-fashioned in that effect. I suppose. I don't really know what effect they have. What I do see of social media, as it's reported in the newspapers that I read and Twitter feeds, it seems to me that many of the characters and pastimes that are promoted therein provide ample grounds for their own ironical jesting. I'm sorry, I can't say any more about that because I don't know very much about it. It's not something that it's not something that I've yet become interested in. Academically, in research terms, I may well, but at the moment I haven't very much. So.
Okay, thank you. How to jest if the leader is a jester himself, disconnected from reality and living in his own delusion?
Oh, we're talking about Donald J. Trump. Well, you can't, can you? I mean, the whole performativity of Trump's period as a politician. It was delusional. It was a joke in every sense of the word. I mean, it was a joke in that it was a ridiculous performance. It was a jest that broke almost all conventions that one would associate with the seriousness and the rigor and importance of the role. You can only laugh at and hope that by virtue of the unironic, unreflexive performance, that sufficient people of democratic persuasion will be persuaded that this idiocy has to stop, which is what actually happened in the United States, despite the fact that there were 75 million other people who thought that the idiocy was rather a good performance, which is a somewhat worrying phenomenon.
Okay, what is the role of culture in promoting or suppressing any form of gesturing in an academic institution? Among the different academic institutions' culture, who should take the lead in creating a culture that promotes gesturing?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question. Academic institutions are very serious places. The role of culture is increasingly important in them in order to try to promote equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And any jesting of those attempts at cultural integration is not likely to be treated well. So I think where, there is a politics to jesting. And I mean, jesting in terms of those kinds of cultures that are integrating the EDI agenda, then the politics of jesting against it usually take a fairly retro and, let us say, masculinist and often right-wing complexion. And so that's something that we, excuse me, we need to be careful of. Of course, ideally, a culture in an academic institution should be one of inclusivity that tolerates difference. But Some differences become harder to tolerate than some others. Some business schools find it extremely difficult to, as I said in the talk, the examples of Leicester Business School and the French business schools, who find the propinquity of some folk within those schools to jest a little about the serious business of management, the capitalist economy and its maintenance as a joke too far. And this, I think, is deeply unfortunate. An institution that can't tolerate its serious jesters is, I think, one that takes itself too seriously. Excuse me.
Jesting has inherent ambiguity, such that it's capable of being used repressively to enact power and exercise control, but also capable of critique, challenge, and subversion. I would like to ask you if these are not mutually exclusive possibilities, and that it depends upon the context within which jesting is manifested. Thus, does jesting become an organizational mechanism? What do you think about that?
It certainly can be. It certainly often is. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Are they mutually exclusive? Not necessarily. A lot depends upon temporality. Something which may be used repressively to enact power and exercise control in the moment can also be capable of critique, challenge, and subversion in the longer term. So I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. It definitely depends upon the context in which jesting is manifested. Does jesting become an organizational mechanism? It can do, and I think it's a if I may use the word, it's not a word I normally use in reference to organizations, but it's probably a healthy thing for jesting to become an organizational mechanism, because it provides a safety valve in which dissonance and difference can be constituted in a way which has potential, but is potentially not threatening. So I think jesting can become an organizational mechanism. I cited one recent practical example, well, fairly recent, with Paul Birch and his period as a corporate jester in British Airways in the 1990s. More recently, the Cirque du Soleil, the francophone Canadian circus, employed Madame Zhu as a jester to ensure that board meetings didn't become too focused on the technicalities of the bottom line and the details of the organization, but to remember that the mission and the mandate of the organization was to spread pleasure and joy, to spread fun. And so Madame Zhu would use humor in board meetings to communicate that, and she was appointed by the CEO to do so. So yeah, I mean, I think perhaps more organizations could do with their Madame Zhus.
Okay, how to be a jester in times of political correctness? Ultimately, a jester needs a proper audience.
Yeah, well, I agree. In times of political correctness, the jester can often be on the wrong side of history. You know, I'm sure that in the common rooms up and down the great and good universities around the land, there's a lot of jesting against the political correctness of the younger generation, with its desire to topple statues and to rename buildings and institutions. But you know, the toppling of the statues is a symbolic action. The renaming of buildings and places is a symbolic action, and it's highly symbolic. It's a way of It's a token acknowledgement of a past in which too much was swept under the carpet of orthodoxy that was cruel, inhumane, was frankly unethical and wrong. And so to jest against that, those youthful enthusiasms is to produce a particularly, I think, regressive and retrograde form of administrative politics.
Okay, we have mistreated your voice, I think, and maybe we will stop there. We thank you very, very much, Stewart, for this very stimulating talk, and we all our congratulations for this so well-deserved Penrose Prize. Thank you again.
And you know, it's nice to be at EURAM, even if 10,000 miles away, and doing so virtually. And I hope that next year, perhaps we will all have an opportunity to meet face to face. Maybe not, but it would be great if we could. So I was new friends and re-greeting old friends, if that's the case. So have a great conference. It's bedtime for me now. In fact, I'm way past my bedtime. It's 11:20 at night now. And for this reason, I won't be engaging in the conference because, well, it's the times don't, you know, all this webinaring is okay, but to the extent that it's located in a hemisphere other than ours, it makes life very difficult, almost impossible. So anyway, have a great conference, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And I hope people found something hopefully amusing and hopefully something stimulating in it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again. Good night, Australia.
Good night. Good night.